Good evening and welcome to another episode of Free Media, Free Minds, Cape Town TV's show that looks at the free flow of information in our democracy and some of the obstacles to that free flow. Tonight we ask the question, do we see Africa through Western eyes? South Africa, Cape Town in South Africa, on the continent, and yet often we look at the continent as outsiders. With me in the studio to look at this question, I have Crystal Alderson, former SABC representative in West Africa and a journalist for the Africa Report. Welcome, Crystal. And Dumisani Moyo from the Open Society Foundation for Southern Africa. And Dumisani is in Cape Town this week to promote a book he's recently edited about radio in Cape Town. Welcome, Dumisani. I mean, let's get right into it. Crystal, in South Africa, how do we see Africa?
Oh, absolutely. We see Africa through Western eyes. There's no doubt about that. I mean, we can, if we just look at daily analysis of what we read or what we consume as consumers of news in Africa, and it's all either sensationalization of Somali pirates or perhaps Somalia with the kind of, war that is happening there, or famine in South Sudan, or, so there's no contextual issue. So you have to look really hard to find the true and representative story of Africa in South Africa.
Dumisani, you agree, all doom and gloom and dying babies?
I can't agree with Christian more. I mean, Africa is not that well represented in the South African media. I think the South African media have got lots of limitations when it comes to reporting Africa. I think most of the footage, most of the images we see about Africa, negative images, some of them actually derived from Western media. So in many ways you find that although you now have a lot of local ownership in Africa, I mean in African countries, the images that dominate the screens are images that are borrowed from Western media.
And Crystal, is the medicine we need more positive images?
I don't think it's necessarily about positive images. I think it's about telling the reflective story of Africa with all its beauty, with all its conflict and all its contradictions. I think that as consumers, that's what we're asking for. What we're finding now is that we're not getting either. We're getting, as Dumisani pointed out, it's Western-based news agencies that's in every African country, in all 55 countries. We find Reuters, we find Associated Press, we find the French. So they set the news agenda for us. So as local consumers or local news organizations, they subscribe to those organizations, paying big fees to London, to Paris, to New York.
So we are quite literally being fed a Western picture of a Western stream of what they want us to know about what is a complex continent, because it's not the positive sunshine journalism we're after, it's the complexity and nuances. And at this point I want to introduce an insert, a Ethiopian filmmaker who really speaks very poignantly about the power of telling the African story. His name is Haile Garima, and he's speaking on a French television station. Let's take a look at this.
My guest today is known for his independent, direct storytelling that's anything but Hollywood. Haile Garima makes films about Ethiopia's struggle. His best known is the acclaimed Sankofa, which won a stack of international awards, including the Golden Bear at the Berlin Film Festival. His latest work is called Taser, and I'm really pleased to say Haile Garima joins us now. Welcome to France 24.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, I wanted to start by asking you about something you once said. You said cinema as a weapon. Explain that to us.
Well, all battles or struggles or conflicts begin from story. Whose story are we telling? And especially Africa, for a long time, a 400 history of colonial storytelling, and we have had not our fair chance, especially in film. Although we do it around the fire with our grandmothers and mothers and fathers, we've never told the world our side of the story. And so for me, it's a weapon. The camera itself is a weapon, because you are sending a story, claiming your story and saying, I do exist. And for me, it's a much better weapon than the so many guns we have in the world. The elite in Africa has failed to be history makers. And so it's really part of the bankrupt political climate from South Africa to Gambia to Ethiopia to Ghana. We have this elite that is really manufactured to be imitated and innovative history makers. And therefore they create these false wars between each other and then endanger these young people.
With your work, it seems that you want to tell stories about Ethiopia as it really exists, not as how Westerners see it. Do you think that the film industry fails to represent the world as it really is?
Oh yeah, for years. From the 100 years history of cinema, we have been just fixtures of Western Romeo and Juliets. We are just the chair, the furniture. Our humanity has never been, depicted, in my view, because we are at the disposal of active Euro-American love story or war, whatever it is. The principal characters are always Euro-Americans, and therefore Africans have always been just the backgrounds. We just hardly breathe in the movies, and so when we get the opportunity, I think we should profile our human face and see what comes out of it.
But the mainstream, it's never really been something that you've strived for, has it?
No, I was in fact at UCLA, just next door to Hollywood, never stepped foot there. I was earlier around a lot of Latin American, African, and third world filmmakers, alternatively looking for another way of expressing ourselves. So from the outset, as soon as I discovered cinema, I was going to go this route, pay the price to make the films I want to make.
So there you have it, storytelling as our weapon. And who tells the story really defines a space. Crystal, you spent a lot of time in West Africa as the SABC's correspondent. How was that SABC weapon deployed?
Well, I mean, the SABC started a very ambitious project, and that is to have bureaus all over Africa and actually have a 24-hour news channel. Now, I mean, as Dumisani would know, that news or media and operating in Africa doesn't come cheap. Nevertheless, the SABC managed to get the money together and opened offices in Africa, and I don't think any other news organization have tried that again in terms of South African news organization. So yes, so I was deployed to West Africa, covering West, a bit of Central, a bit of East at times, and North Africa. So, I was fortunate to see the continent from all eyes and angles. But of course, I mean, I went there as a journalist, but not forgetting that I am South African and that my stories ultimately is to a South African audience. And so you try to tell that complexity, and I think I really tried, and traveling the length of breadth of Senegal, Ghana, and various other countries. But of course, as a journalist, you're also there for the breaking news. So, in Sierra Leone or in Guinea-Bissau, when there's a coup d'etat, that is your story. But you also try to tell your story to a different audience that will never be there, and trying to unpack that complexity of colonialism, of its history, of being a failed state, because we can't run away from those things. Some of African states are badly run and it's weak. But telling that color story.
Yeah. Having a bureau on the ground really allowed you to tell the story in between the elections and in between the coups. I mean, Dumisani, you've worked a lot with media in Zimbabwe. Are there media outfits there that are trying to tell the Zimbabwean story with its complexity, not propaganda for either side of the electoral conflict?
Well, Zimbabwe is a very interesting country when it comes to media, because it's got a long history of state-dominated media. So you find that the state owns and controls the main channels when you talk about television, radio, even the newspapers. So you find that in that kind of context, particularly when you look at the conflict that has been taking place in Zimbabwe over the past decade, there's dominance of state propaganda in the media. But at the same time, you find that people always find alternatives. So what you have in Zimbabwe is a mushrooming of alternative voices, particularly on the internet, where you had several news websites that were developed by Zimbabweans who went into exile. You also had a few radio channels that are beaming from outside as sort of exiled media operating, sending images and news about Zimbabwe.
So, Crystal, your sense, having worked on the continent, Is Zimbabwe an exception, or are a lot of the broadcasters and journalists in different parts of the continent still dominated very much by a state-controlled model?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, Zimbabwe is not the unique. It's all over Africa, for some exceptions like Kenya, like Ghana, like Senegal. So I think, and this is the reality, is that because broadcasting, it's still a sense of elitism or expensive, it costs money, and the state entity. And what we find in most countries in Africa is that the state uses that platform to propagate, because that's the only platform they have. So they use their radio, they use the newspaper, and they use the TV station to propagate. So you then have the mushrooming of alternatives. And I think that is what's pretty amazing all over Africa. Yeah. Some might not have all the resources, others do. And then you find that that different voices are coming out. However, I must say that for me, that also creates a whole set of other issues, because we found, for instance, in Kenya, post-election, covering the post-election violence, a lot of the local stations, so-called independent stations, were very active in violence.
Yeah, we're going to look at some of the alternative voices that are coming from below on the continent after our break. But very quickly, Crystal, the SABC Africa project, to what extent was that a attempt to give voice to the continent, and to what extent was it South Africa's kind of state? It's been suggested that it has a sub-imperialist kind of South African dominance, CNN of Africa.
Yeah. One would naive to think that it wasn't part of a broader policy. South Africa, as we know, our own minister has just been voted in as the AU. So South Africa is ambitious. So having a broadcaster on the continent shows your muscle. We were the first African broadcaster to be on the continent. Yeah. That's not to be frowned upon. So we were an extension of South Africa's foreign policy.
Yeah. Well, very interesting. You're watching Free Media, Free Minds. We're asking, do we see Africa, our continent, through Western eyes? We're going to come back to the discussion straight after this break.
Is your life being torn apart by substance abuse? Are your family and friends expressing concern about your behavior? If you cannot face another day feeling lonely and depressed, give Akron House a call.
We are a dedicated team with a wealth of experience, committed to providing excellent treatment at an affordable price. Call us now on 021 790 7779.
Welcome back to Free Media, Free Minds. This evening we're asking, do we see Africa through Western eyes? Who's telling the African story in South Africa? You can SMS your views to 074 103 6704 or drop us an email, freemedia@capetowntv.org. With me in the studio, I'm chatting to Crystal Alderson, a reporter with Africa Report and former SABC correspondent in West Africa, and Dumisani Moyo from Open Society Foundation for Southern Africa, who's just launched a book about radio in South Africa. And Dumisani, before the break, you were saying that there are voices, there are authentic African voices. Tell us a bit more about what you know of the continent.
Well, I think we tend sort of to paint the context with the same brush, but I think there are certain voices here and there that try to articulate the African story in a different way. So I think if you take Zimbabwe, for instance, you had a number of independent newspapers that continued to tell the Zimbabwe story under very difficult conditions. But I think on a continental level, I think there are certain journals that are emerging that are also trying to to tell the African story in a more different way. For instance, if you look at New African, it's an attempt, you might quarrel with some of their reportage, but I think it's an attempt to try to tell an African story, the African story from a more different perspective compared to what you have in the usual Western diet.
I mean, Crystal, your sense of the authentic African voices out there, the health of the independent media, which is often commercial media, we should note.
Yes. No, I think those voices are definitely emerging. I mean, obviously with the help of organizations like Dumisani's, that's really assisting organizations to raise that independent voice and tell different stories. And I think with the emergence of radio, I mean, ultimately radio is the medium for Africa, as far as I'm concerned. You see that it's becoming cheaper, you can produce stories. You also have other alternative sources like Interpress Service, which is a sort of global alternative news media site.
With a more human rights set of news
Absolutely,
values.
So it's there. Unfortunately, Mark, who consumes it? It's us that's consuming it. Who do we want to reach?
But I think what is also important is what Christelle was saying during the break about the community media. We tend to focus on these urban-centered commercial media, but the community media are doing quite a lot in terms of telling the African story in the local areas. So you find that most rural areas now in a number of countries in the region, because of the opening up of broadcasting, do have their own stations that tell their own stories, that sing their own songs and allow people to actually sort of participate in sort of the national discourse in their own different local ways.
So, of course, one element of diversity is allowing the nuances and the textures to come from below. But there's also a bigger ideological question around the meta-narrative. Is this a continent that is completely hopeless, or is this a continent that's alive with possibility, or is this a continent that's getting robbed and raped every day? I mean, where's the media that is really talking about the way that wealth is flowing out of our continent, the way our governments are quite systematically underdeveloping our people?
I think, again, you have a problem where you find that the capacity of our media is very limited in terms of reporting some of these big issues, like natural resource extraction in our countries, which is an issue which is quite sad, because Africa is not poor. Africa is rich. It's endowed with so many resources, but there's a lot of corruption, there's a lot of debt dealing in terms of the kind of contracts that are made and so on. But we have limitations in terms of investigative reporting, for instance. So I think that's one area that you see there's need for more improvement in our media to say, how do we report some of these big emerging issues in our region?
I mean, Crystal, you get this dominant, almost anxiety that the Chinese are coming, but in fact, the continent's been under colonial for some time.
Well, I mean, 2 years ago I was at the African Union Summit covering the summit, and the entire room, you could count, there were 5 African journalists and there were 20 Chinese journalists. The point is the Chinese and the China, they're realizing this is an audience, they need to report for their audience back home, and they need to shape an agenda. They've got the resources and the people, so they're going for it. I mean, I think what's happening on the continent is also elite interest, Mark. I mean, the story's changing, and obviously the kind of economic figures are showing that we're the continent that's going to prosper. But what's really happening on grassroots level is really another story of how corruption and incompetence have really impacted on people's lives. But it's also elite interest, because private media in Africa are also owned by the elites shaping agendas. And Kenya is a very interesting example of that. They have a plethora of news media, radio, TV. I think they've only got about 2 or 3 English newspapers, but that's elite interest, but it has shaped the Kenyan media landscape. I think same in Senegal, elite interest owing the private media entities, and that's also shaping an agenda. And I think that's something we don't often talk about, because I think also in Southern Africa we're the last sort of fiefdom of, where we see the emergence of different types of media. And of course, in South Africa, we know what's happening here.
Yeah. So in a way, the elite media in South Africa vacillates between Africa, the alive with possibility for our corporations and our businesses, on the one hand. On the other hand, just a disaster, hopeless, if our government doesn't get it right, we're going the way of Africa. But what about the way Africa is presented at the more popular level? I mean, we look at xenophobia in South Africa. What messages about the rest of Africa are dominant in South Africa?
I think that's why, the SABC's project in Africa was to be lauded, because it really tried to bring an African voice and bring it onto your TV screens, or listening to it on radio, to break down this notion of Africa as this far away, up there, dark place, because we really need to break that. Africa is beautiful, it's diverse, it's got stories to tell, it's got histories, and quite frankly, I think South Africans can learn from the rest of Africa. I think unfortunately that's not happening now, and the way the way stories are therefore reported then, from Africa to South Africa, that perpetuation of that stereotype continues.
Yeah. The significance of Dlamini-Zuma being appointed to head the AU, we get told a very superficial story about Anglophone versus Francophone. What's your sense? What's really at stake? What is South Africa's agenda on the continent?
Well, I'll put my 5 cents in.
Yeah.
I think, firstly, whether either way, I think it's a significant victory. From a gender perspective, that there is a woman that's going to be this position. But of course, South Africa broke a lot of no's. There's been this kind of subtle rule that no big kind of Nigeria, Algeria, South Africa would go for the position. It would be left for smaller countries. So there was a lot of taboos that South Africa had broken, and I think it's left a mark and a wound. And so Dlamini-Zuma will have her work cut out for her. So the first thing that she will have to do is to completely say goodbye to South Africa and focus on her job. And distance herself to some extent from Pretoria. So I think from a media perspective, of course, South Africa, we only read here, oh, congratulations, wow, well done. And we didn't get that nuances.
A very jingoistic, we beat the French.
Exactly, and it's far more complex than that. The fact that Nigeria's Goodluck Jonathan wasn't there, the fact that Menes Zenawi, the president of Ethiopia, wasn't there, the big sort of African players weren't part of the election.
So what are some of the changes we could imagine that in the South African media that could see us getting a more realistic and more informed picture of the continent?
I think there are a number of things that could be done. But it's also complex, because I think one of the issues that you find with South African media is the question of ownership. The ownership of South African media is very concentrated in a few media houses. How ownership affects content is arguable, but there is a high degree to which there's been sort of kind of business as usual in the way in which South African media portray Africa. So
And
I think there's need sort of to break from that that mode of reporting Africa and have a sort of deliberate policy to try to invest in trying to report, in trying to understand Africa a lot better.
And
because I think South Africa is huge. It's got a huge economic clout, and at the same time, it's got this ambition to expand across the continent. But I think that expansion must also be linked to a better understanding of the terrain, a better understanding of Africa, and sort of promoting good
the print media panders to the prejudices of that middle class, literate, urban audience. Crystal, what's the role of the public broadcaster? What were they doing right? Where do we need to go with the SABC?
Yeah, I think firstly, perhaps Dlamini-Zuma's ascension to the position will now force the South African media to actually step up. And perhaps a first way is to get an office in Ethiopia, as a first step to start covering things. I think secondly, unfortunately, Africa costs money. It's not cheap to set up offices. It's not cheap to go and travel. You know, you've got road infrastructure problems. Staying at a hotel, staying at a relatively cheap hotel costs you $200 in a country in West Africa. That's a lot of money.
Which is 1,400 rand
You know,
a night.
so
yeah.
I mean, you really hope that the SABC would step up. I mean, in terms of its you know, its reach, you would want the SABC
And-
to go, but we don't know.
Yeah. And there's obviously an argument to be made for publicly funding this mandate. If we leave it just to the markets, we're going to get the prejudices of the middle class. If we want to know what's happening on our continent and really be able to identify with the challenges and the struggles, we will need to find a way to cover Africa through our own eyes. I want to thank my guests for being with me this evening. You've been watching Free Media, Free Minds, brought to you with the support of the Alternative Information Development Center and Friedrich Ebert Stichting. Tune in next week, and until then, let's keep the information flowing. Thank you, and thank you guys.
Thank you.
I have studied the idea of a democratic and